Hi, my name is Kevin Thomas, W1DED. Today I'm with Bill Thomas, WT0DX. Bill has done a lot of things in ham radio. He's retired, but seems as though he keeps himself very busy. One of the things that he has on his list of things to do is the Deep Space Exploration Society, which I'm really intrigued by. That's not the only topic we're going to cover today. Bill, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's set the stage here. Where are you joining me from, Bill?
So I live in the suburban area of Denver, Colorado, to be specific, the southeast suburbs of Denver.
And tell me about your ham radio background. When did you get licensed first, and why did you go on this journey?
I was first licensed in 1968 when I was in high school. Probably a typical story of a couple of friends were interested in radio, and we found out about ham radio, and we got our licenses. This was in the suburbs of Cleveland, Ohio, where I grew up, and had a lot of fun doing that. After high school, I went off to Purdue University and was active in the ham club there, W9YB, otherwise known as Whiskey 9 Yogi Bear. And it's still an active ham club to this date. I think like a lot of folks, once I got out of college, I got into my career and family, and I didn't do as much operating as I might have. But one notable thing was that my college roommate and I, Steve, N9IP, wrote the first series of articles about microprocessors in QST magazine. This was actually in August. The first article was in August of 1976. It was a three-part series. We talked about microprocessors, and we described a little program we had written to decode Morse code, which is still a popular topic when it comes to microprocessor experimentation. I worked in the consumer electronics, TV ratings, and cable television space, and the last 25 years of my career, I was involved in building electronic program guides. These are the guides that you would see on your cable or satellite box, for the hundreds of channels that those companies usually provided. And it was a brand new product area at the time we got started in the early 90s. And as a result of that, I ended up with 150 patents, which I'm proud of as an accomplishment. And also, eventually we were awarded a technical Emmy for that work. So fun career. Not a lot of ham radio activity during the bulk of my career, but I'll say as I got near retirement, I got quite interested in ham radio again. And so for the past 10 plus years, I've been very active in the hobby. And two other things I'll say is that I live in one of the HOA controlled communities, but I'm very fortunate. I have a remote station that's about 20 miles from my house. It's actually at another ham's house here in the Denver area. He's a major contester, and as such, he has wonderful antennas. And so my remote station is actually the best station I've ever operated because of those antennas. And the other thing that I'm a little bit focused on is chasing grids on 6 meters. And there's something called the FFMA Award, Fred Fish Memorial Award, where you work all 488 domestic grids. I'm just 17 shy of finishing that challenge, which I figure will probably take the next 10 years, given the difficulty of working some of these grids. So that's a little summary of what I've done and what I'm doing today.
Well, I appreciate that summary. And one of the things that comes up a lot in my conversations is the fact that people may get licensed at a young age, but our careers and family and life takes us in a certain direction. And it's just sort of natural that happens, but it's always great to revisit the hobby later on. And that's certainly been my experience over the last 2 or 3 years. Life got in my way for 40 years, and COVID brought me back into it, so I can totally relate to that. Tell me more about that remote station, if you would, before we get into deep space. What's that person have for gear, and towers and antennas? Just a quick summary.
Because the fellow is a dedicated contester, I do not touch his equipment. I, in fact, installed my own equipment. I have an ICOM 7600. I have Elecraft antenna tuner and 500-watt amplifier. We have a rotator control. And all of this runs on a computer that is at that QTH, and all the equipment is plugged into the computer. And then I use a remote desktop program. In my case, I use something called SplashTop to access that. And it's pretty wonderful because I can access that station on literally any device. I can access it on a computer, I can access it on a tablet or my iPhone. In fact, I've made some notable contacts just using my iPhone into that station. And it's a really wonderful setup. Again, it's all about the antennas when you get right down to it.
I do appreciate the number of people that are able to operate remote nowadays. I think it's becoming more and more accepted, but also it's a necessity. I think with a lot of us, including myself, it's really difficult for me to set up a permanent station where I live on this island off the coast of Maine. I could do it. My neighbors probably wouldn't invite me to any of the picnics anymore. So I'm very careful, but I also am working with N7NR with a remote station up in northern Maine, and it really is a great opportunity. And again, I think more and more people are doing that. So let's dive into deep space. I'm really intrigued by your involvement with Deep Space Exploration Society. Start with telling us what that is exactly.
Right. So the Deep Space Exploration Society, which we call DSES, and by the way, it has a website which is dses.science, which I encourage people to go and look at. It tells a lot more of the story. But it's an interesting organization. The members are interested in radio astronomy and or ham radio. So we have an interesting mix of radio astronomers and ham radio operators, and of course some are both. What's truly unique about this organization is that we own a 60-foot dish. So it's one of the largest privately owned dishes actually in the world. And we also have recently upgraded the facility with a new operations building that was funded by ARDC, and we'll talk about ARDC a little bit later. It's located in Haswell, Colorado, which is very rural southeast Colorado. In fact, if you stand on the site and you look in any direction, all you see is the horizon. There is nothing else for you to see in every direction. It's about a 3-hour drive from my home in the Denver area, so it's not someplace that I just drop in at, and that's probably true of a lot of the members of the society. If you don't mind, let me give a little history of the organization, the site, because I got some notes here. It's a little bit detailed. So actually, it goes all the way back to 1991, where the organization was founded, and at that time, it was using two 60-foot dishes that were located in the Boulder, Colorado area and owned by the NTIA. So it was a government-owned dishes, but they allowed the amateurs, the radio astronomers, to use that facility. For a number of reasons, it became not possible to use that site anymore. And in fact, in 2009, that organization basically moved its operation to this Haswell, Colorado location, which was another dish that was built as part of the original program. What was the original program? Well, the original program was funded by the National Bureau of Standards, which is now NIST, and these dishes were built in the late 1950s, actually. Of course, government funded, and they were used for microwave tropospheric scatter, R&D, associated with the DEW line, if you know what that is. So quite an interesting history. Well, that site ran and was used by the government until 1974, at which point the site was decommissioned. And at one time there was a 500-foot tower on that site. Well, they took that down, and also they had high-power AC coming into the site, and that was all taken down, and the area was restored to its original state, if you will. But the dish which, by the way, weighs about 65 tons, was left in place. Now, it sat there for about 10 years, and then through a government auction, a fellow by the name of Paul Plishner acquired the site. And he operated or owned an East Coast-based like microwave components equipment business. And he tried to sell the facility many times, even had at one time a scrap metal company came by, looked at it and said it would be too difficult to take it apart for the scrap metal value. So it sat there. And eventually it was donated to the Deep Space Exploration Society in 2009. So the Society owns the dish, it owns the grounds that the dish are on, and at that time the only building, if you will, was actually an underground bunker that was located on site. Now, it was not a bomb-proof type facility, it was just an underground bunker, and it had a big room for equipment. It had sleeping quarters and a restroom, but it was quite old by the time the organization took it over. In 2010, the organization brought an old government surplus communications trailer to the site. And in 2011, they were able to install or upgrade the motors and move the dish for the first time since 1974. The dish had been positioned in what's called the bird bath position, which is pointed straight up. For 37 years, it had not moved, and they were able to get it moving and working again. Initially, the power on site was a combination of solar and propane generator, but in 2018, one of the club members made a very generous donation, and we were able to run commercial power to the site. So that was a major upgrade to the site. And today we have internet. It's DSL, so it's megabit or two. It gives us access, but you can't do anything too heavy duty with that. However, the local communications supplier, the rural communications supplier, got one of these government contracts to improve communications. So there's a chance we're actually going to get fiber run to the site this coming year, which would be a massive upgrade. The other thing is that the organization wrote its own dish pointing software. It's a very sophisticated system. So for example, when we're doing EME, you just point the dish at the moon once, and then it tracks it the entire day or the entire night with a hands-off activity. There's a lot of different projects that go on at this site. Obviously, we do EME on 1296, and we have a club call called the K0PRT. The PRT stands for Plishner Radio Telescope, so it's a kind of a memorial to the fellow that donated the site to us. We've also done some tropo communications, 500 mile plus, just tropo communications. We do educational outreach to the local community, and we do a lot of radio astronomy work. Hydrogen sources, pulsars, masers, just all kinds of other things. And because it's a very quiet site, we have some other antennas set up there. So we do some Jupiter, solar radiometry, meteor scatters. So it's an interesting combination of whether we're doing science work at the site or amateur radio work at the site. We also have a fully remote HF station there, and I'm always a little bit jealous because it can hear things that I can't hear, even with the great antennas I have, because guess what? I'm in an urban, suburban environment. There's something called noise that seems to affect my reception from time to time. The other thing I'll mention is we have this new facility, a brand new building. It was funded by ARDC. It took us several years to build and finish the facility. Bill Miller, who's a club member, was the project manager, and really pulled off a wonderful thing now. So we have now beautiful operating environment. We have a full kitchen. We have a working restroom. We have an education room. It's heated and air conditioned too. So it's just really going to help, supercharge the club activities. And for example, now we can bring in like a high school science class and host them right at the facility. So anyway, that's bit of a ramble on Deep Space Exploration Society.
Well, I appreciate that. That's great background. I'm curious about how large the membership is, and tell me more about the type of person that would want to become a member and what. I mean, you've already said some of the uses, but I'm curious outside of the ham radio world, are people working with educational organizations or are they working with private industry? Tell me the use.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have about 100 plus members, fully paid up members. A lot of them, of course, are from the Colorado area, but we have membership from around the country. In fact, we've had people fly in to visit the site. We have an annual open house where we invite members and the local community to come in. Our open house this year, we had about 100 people come to the site, which is pretty phenomenal given its remote location. We do have some science experiments underway that are actually uploading data to some universities on a daily basis. But again, we're currently limited because of the internet. And we want to do much more of this, and we've got some new science experiments, some like an interferometers that we're going to be installing on site. And we're very hopeful that once this new internet, the fiber internet's put in place, then we'll have a good, solid, high-speed, low-latency connection to the site, and we'll be able to do a lot more activities. One of the, I'm going to say, rules that we have is that we do not move the dish unless there is a competent supervisor on site. Okay, so we don't allow. Well, you can use it remotely. We have to have people on site when we do that. However, this past summer, we were able to obtain a 30-foot dish from a Silent Key here in the Colorado area. His wife donated it to the club, and we've taken that down. It's currently sitting disassembled at the site, in fact. But one of the projects for this coming year is to get that dish set up and operating, and then we'll probably allow that dish to be operated remotely. Much less of a sort of a mechanical, physical risk involved in doing that. We also have done some outreach to local colleges and universities, and we're planning to get them more involved. Quite honestly, the focus of most of the active members of the club for the last 2 years has been the new building. But now that we've completed that, we've got a lot more time and energy to devote to other experimental uses. Received a second grant from ARDC for a special science/amateur radio experiment that we hope to conduct in the spring of next year. And I'm not going to say anything more about that. I'm going to leave it a little bit of a mystery as to what that is. But if we're successful, I think it's going to be really raise the profile of the organization and the very interesting things that can be done at this facility.
Bill, I recently spoke to Dr. Pat Rife at Rice University, and she has done a great job of connecting ham radio with her work in science and specifically space exploration and astronomy, and gotten a lot of kids, younger people, interested in ham radio in the process. Do you see the same thing happening there at Deep Space Exploration Society?
Yeah, I mean, that's our hope. As I said, we are in very rural Colorado, and we have already, done outreach to, say, the local high schools. And, the science teachers are very interested in what we're doing, and we'll bring some groups on site this coming year. We'd love if they became interested in amateur radio, but again, not all our members are amateur radio operators. They're, radio astronomers. In fact, several of them are retired professors. So we have some very well-versed folks in that area. And we hope to just, again, kind of get the kids excited about STEM, whether it's ham radio or engineering or, other technical areas. We, I think, have a longer-term goal of wanting to do even more of this, right? And again, it's a very unique and special facility that, most most folks would not have access to anything like this otherwise.
Bill, you mentioned earlier the funding and support you're receiving from the ARDC. And the ARDC, Amateur Radio Digital Communications, is a name that just continually has come up over the last couple of years as I've re-entered ham radio. And I'd love to have you explain a little bit more about what you know about the ARDC and how they're contributing to ham radio today.
Yeah, well, I'm a very active volunteer at ARDC, and I'll describe what I do in a few minutes. But I'm actually going to read the mission statement. It's a little bit wordy, but it's got lots of good stuff in it. So let me just read that. The mission of ARDC is to support, promote, and enhance digital communications and broader communications science and technology, to promote amateur radio, scientific research, experimentation, education, development, open access, and innovation in information and communications technology. Okay, that's a mouthful for sure. And it's both broad and sort of narrow at the same time. So clearly, given the name of the organization, we want to promote amateur radio in various forms, and also digital communications, which doesn't have to specifically be related to amateur radio, but typically would overlap, the kinds of things we do in amateur radio. It's a 501c nonprofit foundation, and we distribute funds in the form of grants and scholarships. Also, and this is a little bit of the history of how the fund was originated, we manage something called the 44net, which is a block of 12 million IPv4 addresses allocated to licensed hams for experimentation. As you may know, IPv4 addresses are and have been in short supply. So about 5 years ago, the original allocation was to a ham in California back at the dawn of the internet. And he said, I'd like some IPv4 addresses. And they said, well, how about if we give you the 44 range? You can have 16 million addresses, which is just amazing to think about today. Well, about 5 years ago, the group was formed. They decided to sell a quarter of the assets. So they sold 4 million IPv addresses to one of the large tech companies, and that funded the foundation. Okay, that was the original funding for the foundation. Since then, through investments and other things, foundation has grown. And to remain a nonprofit, we have to grant on average 5% of our foundation funds every year. So we have granted a lot of money over the years. In fact, since 2019, there's been 250 separate grants that have been funded, over $26 million in those grants. And as best we can tell, we've impacted about 78,000 people through these grants. So it's been a very robust activity. And we grant in typically 4 areas. One we call amateur radio. So somebody wants to upgrade their repeater site, maybe for greater coverage. Their community has grown in size and they need to improve their repeater. We will certainly consider those kinds of requests. Another area is education. STEM education, amateur radio education. Someone wants to start up, a licensing course and needs some funding to do that. That's the kind of thing we're interested in. And then the R&D area. And this is typically where some of our largest grants come, and they can be hundreds of thousands of dollars, certainly. One of the projects that we've funded over the years is the M17 Digital Protocol project. And then we have, I call it another category, and this is, for example, scholarships or club grants. So we're a major supporter of the ARRL scholarship program. And we also fund some other scholarship entities such as the Society of Women Engineers. And then we also help fund the ARRL club grants. And of course they have their own program that they run. And we have a kind of a long-term commitment to do that. So You might say, well, how does all this work, right? I mean, this sounds like a lot of work. And it is. I mean, we get typically a couple hundred requests a year. There's a small paid staff that helps administer the grants and run the foundation so that we fulfill all the legal and financial requirements. And then there's a group of volunteers, and we have several committees. We have one that I call what's called the Grants Advisory Committee, or GAC. That's the committee that reviews all these proposals when they come in, and after review makes a recommendation to the board as to whether or not they should be funded. I've been a member of the GAC for 2 years. It's been a wonderful experience. I've learned a lot and seen some really amazing projects come in. And next year I'm actually going to be chairman of that committee, so I'll be even deeper into everything that goes on there. We also have the TAC, the Technical Advisory Committee, and these are the folks that work on this 44net stuff. And there's been a big focus in the last year to really kind of up our game in that area. We manage and operate the assignment of these IPv4 addresses, but we're working to kind of improve the whole process. For example, we've put together a 44net point of presence, or POP, architecture for connecting off-the-shelf routers to the net to make it easier for folks to be able to take advantage of any IPv addresses that they get assigned to them. It's a well-run organization, but again, it's only 4 to 5 years old, so we're still, I'd say, growing and learning how to do things, and also trying to decide what's the best way to fund various kinds of activities. A good example of that is, I mentioned we funded some of the R&D projects, in amateur radio. Well, these development projects, first of all, they're all required by us to be open source. Okay, you must have open access to whatever we fund and develop. But like any development project, quite honestly, they can go on forever. There's always a bug to fix, a new feature to add, an improvement to make, a new version of an operating system that you need to make sure you're compatible with, etc. And we don't view ourselves as, an infinite long-term funder of these activities. We want to help them transition to other funding sources, or even support by the local community. And so that's one of the things that we're, kind of adjusting, we'll be adjusting our strategy on. Just what's the best way to kind of, help guide some of these projects going forward.
So given that the ARDC, at least part of their mission, is to promote amateur radio, support amateur radio, fund amateur radio projects, I'm guessing that the organization spends a lot of time thinking about the future of ham radio. And it's something that comes up a lot in this show. I mean, there's a lot of conversation about the licensed hams in the U.S., for example, being somewhat stagnant, growing slightly. But then there's the second question about how many of that 750,000 are actually active, but a lot of conversation about an aging population. How does the ARDC discuss this, and what conclusions have they come to or maybe arriving at?
I'll make a couple comments. First of all, there are clearly, I'm going to say, strategic discussions that have occurred at the board level that, may not be public yet, of course. I think through our support of the local ham clubs and our education initiatives, we are trying to encourage to bring younger, or I'm going to say even middle-aged people into the hobby and have them be successful. The other thing is, currently, while we talk about the categories that we're interested in, okay, education, amateur radio, R&D, we have not expressed specific needs or projects that we would like to see proposed. So I know there's been discussion at the board level, should we put out specific requests? And I'm not saying I know what they would be, but there is some consideration of that. I'd actually like to transition your question a little bit into something that I'm quite active in my local community here, which is our local ham radio club, the Parker Radio Association, is what I consider just a shining example of what a local club should be. Okay, so we're in the southeast suburbs of Denver. We actually, the club, in fact, just celebrated its 10-year anniversary. The first meeting was like 15 people getting together saying, hey, there's no club, within 5 minutes drive of our house. Let's start a club. And this core group has just done a marvelous job of growing the club and stimulating activity and participation. And one of the key things that it does is it has what it calls an Elmer team. This is a very specific of high energy folks that are helping new members and new hams get on the air. One of the biggest issues that we've seen is someone gets a technician license for whatever reason. Maybe they do four-wheeling and they think, hey, it'd be great to have a radio. But then they never do anything with it. And they don't explore anything beyond maybe, talking through the local repeater occasionally. So this organization will go to the ham's house. They will help advise them on what kind of antennas they might put up, including stealth antennas if they're in a homeowners association. They'll advise on equipment. They'll help them operate. For example, they just finished last night the second of a training course on how to use your handheld, how to program it, how to use it, etc. And they also hold many activities throughout the year that are just fun. In fact, the model for the club is where we have fun, play radio, and keep the squelch loose. So you can kind of tell what the attitude is about all of this, right? And we get about 30 to 50 people that show up at every meeting. We have 2 meetings a month. One is a regular presentation. The second one is focused on Elmer. Bring any question you have. Let's talk about, things, right? And one of the most popular activities that they do every year is it's a four-wheeling adventure with ham radio. So we're here in the Denver area, so we can take four-wheel vehicles and have some fun going up to some peaks here, and then operate ham radio at that peak for a couple hours, have lunch, and then come back down again. And whether you have a four-wheel vehicle or not, you can be a passenger on someone who does. So again, it's just let's have fun, let's do ham radio, let's learn a lot, and let's be active. And I think this is a lot of what ham radio needs, I think, going forward, right? And we encourage younger people, we encourage, I'm going to say like middle-aged people who've discovered or learned about it to get into the hobby. So I think that's a beneficial thing that's done. And circling back to ARDC, these are the kind of things that we like to fund, right? Is clubs that are expanding their presence in the community to try and attract people to the hobby.
It's impressive work. I think I'd like you to take it a little bit further, and I'm going to let the ARDC off the hook, as well as the Parker Amateur Radio Club off the hook. And I'm going to put you on the hook for a second. You're clearly thoughtful and an intellectual thinker. I'm curious what you think about how you translate what's going on at Parker to the entire country. Because I hear this a lot on the show. I think there are a lot of very granular things that are happening that are positive for the hobby. And I see these pockets of club activity, the YCARS down in, I think it's South Carolina, North Carolina, various clubs that are very active and doing great work. I guess with my business background, I'm always wondering, how do we expand that idea? How can we impact thousands rather than just 40? So I guess the question for you, Bill, is what are the larger issues in your mind that need to be overcome within ham radio so that we have momentum? And again, I don't want to take anything away from Parker or Y Cars. I think that's all important work, but one person at a time, one scholarship at a time might not be enough to move hundreds and thousands. What are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I think it's a great question, and one that there's no, I'm going to say, easy answer for, from what I've seen. To be quite blunt, one of the reasons that the Parker Club is so successful is the core team of people on the board and others that are just very regular participants, right? The other thing is, and this is kind of funny, at this 10-year anniversary, they did a review of all the activities that they had done during the year. And out of that, they decided, we're really a group of people that like to eat and do ham radio. Almost every activity involves some kind of like social eating function, it turns out, which, seems kind of like a silly comment, but I think it gets to the heart of making the organization welcoming, fun, not always 100% about ham radio, getting to know people. And that's, I'm going to say a bit difficult to replicate without a core group of people that sort of have that DNA or that attitude about things in general. Now, you could say, well, you could take, for example, the meeting topics that we present, and you could find some way to turn them into distributable items that people could, play at club meetings. But I think, what I've seen, again, and there are other clubs in the Denver area, many of them are active. So I don't want to, say that this club's the only good club in the area. It certainly isn't. But, the face-to-face, the engagement, the willingness to help is just a key ingredient. And when the ARDC, again, sees an organization that seems to have that kind of outlook, we're always very interested in helping them, right? And we've had some proposals to fund, amateur radio courses with an intention of making the materials available on a broad basis, whether it's, YouTube recordings or other things like that. But I think without that kind of spark and energy at the local level, and it doesn't have to be a large number of people, it just needs to be a small group of people that, want to do that. I think that's key because, again, let's face it, it's pretty easy to get a ham license if you set your mind to it these days. But it's really all about engaging after that and turning it into something that you find beneficial for, the rest of your career. Beyond that, I don't know, quite honestly. It's on our minds and a difficult challenge, and certainly, at ARDC we do think about that, and we do try to support things, and we're always looking for the magic ingredient if we can find it.
Well, I love your focus, or the club's focus, on the social aspect. It's another topic that comes up a lot in my interviews, where we start off talking about CW and antennas and kind of the technical aspect. Maybe we talk about contesting, but then invariably it comes back to camaraderie. That really at the core, it's having fun, meeting people, knowing people. I spoke to Jose, CT1 BOH, world-class contester, the other day. And in the end, after all of his very fantastic advice on technique and practice and all the things that make him a great contester, it really came down to this idea that camaraderie is so important to him. So I think you're onto something, and the Parker Club is onto something, that if we could figure out a way to make that more viral, maybe. Again, there's no easy answer to it, but one of the things that comes to mind is that we have things like the Contest University at Dayton every year. Where is the Club Leadership University, where we attract a representative from Y Cars and a representative from Parker, and we get younger club leaders. Not that we're here today to solve all these problems, but I think it deserves continuing thought, and I'm really impressed and pleased that the ARDC and yourself are spending time thinking about that. I think that as a community, we're really relying upon ARDC and the ARRL to help us problem solve this because I'm older in my ham radio career, but I hope to be doing it for the next 20, 25 years at least. And I'd like to see it be a robust hobby. And I'm talking to a lot of people that agree with that. Some are just discouraged, some are pessimistic, but largely they've gotten a lifetime's worth of enjoyment from this and they'd like to see it continue for themselves, but also for younger people. So kudos to your team for trying to tackle this seemingly unsolvable problem.
It would be interesting, and I go to Dayton every year. Been going for the last few years. I don't know if there is a session that they could plan where it's all about how to energize your local club. Okay, and again, there'd be a number of us that would be more than happy. In fact, I know several of the board members of our club go to Dayton every year. I'm sure they'd be thrilled to talk about what happens and how that's benefited folks in this area.
Well, certainly a lot to think about. And Bill, I'm looking at the clock. I've taken up enough of your time today. I really appreciate you joining me. It's been very informative, and it's just one more aspect of ham radio that I wasn't aware of until we met via email and then this conversation.
Thanks a lot. It's been great.
I've been talking to Bill Thomas, WT0DX. My name is Kevin, W1DED. Thank you for joining me on the show.